talk by Chaz Miller called Public-Private Partnerships, Back to the Future of Space Development. And Chaz is a senior advisor for the commercial space at NASA and a leader of numerous private space organizations. Charles Miller is highly knowledgeable on all things space. With a diverse high-level experience in both the public and private sectors, Miller is uniquely qualified to discuss the importance of public-private partnerships and how they can be utilized in the future. So, without further ado, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, James. So, I think this is the perfect talk right after the very good talk that George Neal just gave at lunch. For those of you who were there, George is always insightful. And I'm going to be talking about a very similar thing, public-private partnerships, the early days of aviation, the NACA, and fit very well. And I want just at the end of the talk, I hope to leave you with two things. One, that public-private partnerships have worked, do work, and will work in space. And if we put our attention to the details of figuring out how to make them work for us. And two, that utilizing that approach enables a very exciting future in space. So I'm going to be talking about actually how this might enable potentially exponential growth in what we all want to do in space. So thank you. Next slide. So the first thing, and I was just recently rereading Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is that in a paradigm shift, one of the requirements for a paradigm shift is that the existing paradigm is not working in some ways. It's not solving the problems you want. The theory isn't explaining phenomena that's going on. And that is true of what's going on with the current paradigm in space. The Apollo program approach worked wonderfully for Kennedy, and it hasn't been working for what we've been currently trying to do. And we've been struggling to kind of come up with a new approach. And what I want people to understand in a paradigm shift, the people who are in the paradigm and struggling with it, they're not bad, okay? And often they're very smart. And just to share with you, their thinking is actually quite logical within the existing paradigm. And so we're struggling with that with the nation right now, and I just want to share a few examples of this. In 1776, when we had the Declaration of Independence signed, which we all learn in books and weren't there, we don't understand that 1/3 of the nation didn't want to declare independence. And 1/3 of the nation did, and the other third was on the fence. Decades later, after we were an independent nation, there were still large numbers of Americans who wanted to go back to be part of the British Empire. There was a paradigm shift. In 1895, one of the most advanced scientists of the time declared heavier than flying air vehicles are impossible, Lord Kelvin. In 1958, one of the nation's leading businessmen, Tom Watson, CEO of IBM, declared there's a world market for about 5 computers a year. In 1978, Ken Olsen, the CEO of one of the nation's leading computer companies, DEC, said there's no reason for any individual to have a computer in his home. There was these companies like Apple and all these other companies that were growing by gangbusters, and he just didn't get it. He was a very smart guy. He was an expert in his subject matter. In 1981, Bill Gates said, why would anybody want more than 640K? So this is not an issue of logic or intelligence. We have mental models in our heads that it's hard to let go of to do a different mental model. Now, one of the other key things for switching, easing the transition as a paradigm, you need to see that the other paradigm works for what you need. Or and that's not an easy thing to do. So next slide. Albert Einstein was right. He says we need a different level of thinking when you switch to a new paradigm. We need as a community, as a nation, to work together to find that together. And for those of you who have seen the new paradigm, I ask that you take the time to help your fellow citizens, your colleagues, your business partners to figure out how to make it work. Next slide. So want this to be a provocative question. Is exponential growth possible in space? The theories of exponential growth have been around for a while, and in fact, we see them all the time around us, and we maybe take them for granted. And I want to narrow down on a set of exponential growth type things that just from public-private partnerships. So next slide. So we have public-private partnerships everywhere. We're surrounded by them. This conference is a public-private partnership. You have a non-for-profit corporation with commercial companies at a NASA-managed center. We have them within NASA. Railroads were a public-private partnership. The Transcontinental Railroad was sponsored by the U.S. government with private capital at risk and competition, and it was amazingly fast development of connecting the continent. The highways and the automobiles are a public-private partnership. All of these examples here are examples of areas where there was exponential growth. Once it started taking off, it spontaneously developed huge amounts of infrastructure across the nation. Toll bridges, toll roads, utilities are significant. You got pipelines in Alaska, $8 billion invested by private companies and $20 billion in today's dollars. Air transportation. So there's very interesting comparisons of a variety of these. That I've actually been thinking about doing a comparison of the Trans-Siberian Railroad against the American Transcontinental Railroad. It's the initial looks, we took a public-private partnership. It looks like we had about an order of magnitude more productivity per worker in doing the Transcontinental Railroad than the Tsarist Russia did, who basically had enforced slave labor, in their development. I want to dive deeply into one of those, and I'm going to go into air transportation. So, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin was the human in space. And I need to update this chart a little bit, but in 48 years later, in 2009, 46 people traveled into orbit. And the risk of loss of life, according to our NASA internal numbers at that time, a couple years ago, was 1 in 77. That's a conventional straight line, growth. That's what we've had in space right now. In aeronautics, where we had a public-private partnership growth, and I'll get into that differently, we went from 1 person in 1903 to 39 million 48 years later. And that excludes China and Russia. And we had a safety record of 1 in 288,000. It was your chance of dying in an aviation accident at the time. Well, the technical challenges of space and air are different, and I acknowledge that, so a couple orders of magnitude of that can be from the technical difficulties. It's clear that 6 orders of magnitude difference is pretty large, and some of that, I assert, is from the different models of development and acquisition. Let me go into that a little bit. There's more examples of that. Next slide. So, the United States has made 3 major attempts at low-cost access in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. First, the shuttle, NASP, and then X-33 Venture Star activity. None of them achieved the goal of low-cost access. The shuttle was a successful operational machine, but it didn't fly 50 times a year at $10.5 million of flight marginal cost. It didn't do it. Everybody acknowledged that. We had a 4th major attempt in the last decade, and about 6-7 years ago, for the National Air and Space Initiative, and it collapsed after it looked like it was going to cost about $50 billion on the upwards to do all the things it wanted to do. Now, all of these had different technologies and different approaches, and they tend to use lessons learned from the technology and then try to do a different technical approach. But they all had one thing in common. Next slide. They all had a central program mindset to go out and figure out who's the smartest guy and who has the smartest design and pick that winner and put all your eggs in that basket. And when it collapsed, they take a couple years off, dust themselves off, and try again, then pick another winner. Well, we'll do it different this time, a different technology, a different architecture approach, but they all had the same mindset. Next slide. So my assertion here with low-cost access is we've been repeating history. In 1898, the Department of War granted Sam Langley $50,000 to invent the airplane. It was the largest federal R&D grant in U.S. history at that time. He promised he would do it within a year. It took him 5 years, and he was over budget by $20,000 for his first attempt. He spent all his time building one vehicle. He hadn't really tested any at the sub-levels and built up. And he put it all on the line in front of a large public and had a catastrophic failure twice in late 1903. When he failed, he wasn't close to inventing a practical airplane. And the Department of War was so embarrassed, they shut down the entire project. The Smithsonian forbade Sam Langley. He was the head of the Smithsonian. The trustees forbade him from working anymore on it. And the New York Times published one of their infamous editorials, says, not from 1 to 10 million years will we see human flight. A couple months later, 2 bicycle shop mechanics invented the airplane for $1,000 of their own money. Next slide. Now, this is a question for you. Hindsight is 20/20. By all objective measures, using the central program mindset, picking Sam Langley was the right thing to do. He was one of our nation's preeminent and most preeminent respected scientists. He was head of the Smithsonian Institution. He had worked on this problem for 15 years using Smithsonian funds. He had demonstrated a glider that did a complete circle over the Potomac, 16-foot glider. So he was clearly appeared to be on the verge of human flight. But the Wright brothers were unknown mechanics in Ohio. It was not possible to know that they were the right people to pick. The Wright brothers didn't even know it. Next slide. They wrote a letter to the Smithsonian in 1899 asking for help and sharing their thinking, and they said they just wanted to make a contribution to help the future worker who will attain final success. Next slide. So another one I want to share is they took an incremental test strategy, which is much different than the way Sam Langley did. They did rapid do-learn loops. They were doing small tests during the year. And every year they went out to North Carolina and did major flight tests on their experiments and their thinking on the theory of flight. I want to share with you, in fall 1901, about 2 years into this, they had some real problems, and they considered quitting. They considered the whole summer to be a failure. They talked about quitting, and it took him a couple months to get over it, and Wilbur went out and gave a speech, and he recommitted himself. But in the time, that Orville recalls that Wilbur said, not in 1,000 years would man ever fly. Next slide. So they went back to first principles, and they invented the first practical wind tunnel. They tested all kinds of airfoils, because you couldn't go to anybody for a wind tunnel test. And they had fundamental insights that ended up rapidly leading to their breakthroughs in 1903 and later. Next slide. So what was the lesson learned? The nation at the time learned the lesson that the entrepreneurial spirit had publicly trumped the central program mindset. And so national leadership said, well, we don't need to do anything. George shared with the audience today that we bought that one plane, and we didn't buy any other planes for a couple years. Is that the laissez-faire strategy was what worked best. And there was a bunch of activity going on with air shows and prizes that were going on, lots of activity. But what we didn't realize, a bunch of other countries took a different approach. They took a public-private partnership approach. They set up federal laboratories, and they started buying planes from their companies. So what was the result? So we, in 1908, had demonstrated both here in the United States and Europe that flight worked. The Europeans caught up with us within 1 year, and they passed us, blew by us in the next year. And by the time of World War I, they were well ahead of us. The U.S. government bought the second plane from U.S. industry in 1911, while they were buying dozens of planes. The only conclusion I can make from this is that public-private partnerships, smartly designed, will trump laissez-faire. Smartly designed. Next slide. So the Taft administration recommends the creation of a laboratory. They see what's going on in Europe and the rest of the world that we're getting blown away, and they propose legislation that gets voted down in 1913. We only create the NACA 2 years later in March of 1915 as a last-minute Navy appropriations writer, taking the old legislation and adding it on to this Navy bill, because we suddenly said, oh, we're in trouble. There's a war in Europe. Our people will get blown out of the sky. We need to do something. We actually were so far behind, we had the Wright Brothers company in Dayton was building French or British planes. We actually decided we weren't going to send any American planes over to Europe for the war, and we were using their designs and building them and sending over there. Next slide. So we set up the NACA. One of the very key things is they saw their role is building an industry, energizing an industry. That was their part of their unofficial job. And from the outset, they decided that they were going to be an industry booster, limited only by their need to be fair and impartial. Next slide. If you look at the analysis here, and this is from a presentation by Gary Olson, who's here at the conference, that it took about 5 years from 1915 until 1920 for the Langley Laboratory to become operational. So they were taking on other roles. They had to say, what can we do at very low cost to help industry? And so it turns out, in hindsight, coordination and cooperation was as important as the R&D, particularly in the early years. Next slide. So there's a bunch of things they did that were hugely valuable. They facilitated the patent light cross-license agreement into the war between Glenn Curtiss and the Wright brothers over fighting over patents and getting them back to innovating. It was preventing any other American entrepreneurs from getting a business because you got caught up in a lawsuit the moment you license a patent from either side. They facilitated a cooperative agreement that ended up creating the Liberty Engine. And in 1916, 1 year after the creation of the NACA, they recognized that industry needed customers. They became an industry advocate. They went to the U.S. Army and the post office and said, you need to start an airmail service. Okay, that wasn't their job. They were officially just set up to solve practical problems in technology and have this lab, but they took on these other roles as part of their broader mission. It took 9 years for the Kelly Airmail Act, 2 years for the Army Air Corps to start, 9 years for the Kelly Airmail Act to go. They recommended the creation of the Bureau of Aeronautics, which became the FAA much later. Next slide. And they also did many of the things that the NACA is currently remembered today as the technical advances, but they did it for everybody. So bring your plane here, we'll figure out how to reduce the drag, we'll invent the cowling that everybody can use, figure out how to have pop-up landing gear, airfoils, variable pitch propeller. It was helping broadly the whole industry. But they treated the industry and the DoD as their customer. Next slide. So the result of all this public-private partnership, thousands of concepts and ideas were tried. Most of them failed, but many of them succeeded, and they grew into successful businesses and had exponential growth for our nation in aviation. But what must be understood, and this is a key message from OCT, failing and learning is not truly failure if you take it on and apply it to the next scene. We want to actively promote and encourage people to take risks and learn, and do it in such a way that you don't collapse the entire initiative and you pick it up and you learn from it and you do the next effort. Think of Orville and Wilbur Wright if they had quit in 1901. That was the type of failure and learning, and many of these companies did so during the halcyon days of the early years of aviation. Next slide. So NASA's strategy is really about back to the future. We're adapting the NACA model for part of what we're doing. This is an open innovation strategy. We're using it in COTS, in commercial crew programs. We're using it in the cruiser program. We're using it in the Innovative Lunar Data Demonstrations Program and OCT's Space Technologies Program. So in conclusion, we are entering a new era. The rate of innovation in my opinion, is going to significantly accelerate, perhaps exponentially if we do this right. The source of that innovation is going to be unpredictable, and the America's entrepreneurs, many of you in this audience, are critical to this strategy. We need you as a nation. We want you as a nation. We need to figure out how to work together for the nation. Open competition and public-private partnerships are key. And if you are one of those entrepreneurs, I want to encourage you to put your eye on the stars and focus on how to create value and make a fortune while you're doing it. And the final question is, I think what we're all interested in is who's going to be the next Wright brothers, the Bill Boeings, or the Glenn Martins. Thank you.
All right, we have some time for a few questions, and because there's no moderator to really be asking the questions, we're just going to use the mics for this talk. So if anyone has a question, just raise your hand, and we'll run the mics too.
Would a predefined set of purchase services be, an aspect of that? Something like, say, we'll pay $500 a kilogram for anything delivered to orbit, with some, basically, so if you're going to do research at some level, you have to pick winners and losers. How about just picking an end result that you want, rather than technologies along the way, and try to fund that?
Well, we're doing that in some ways. We are doing that with the Innovative Lunar Data Demonstration. We're picking some results to deliver some data. If you looked at what the Wright brothers, they told us what the result was, and they went and do it. We have the CRS, commercial resupply contracts, is what the result we want. The COTS, we had milestone payments based on what result we wanted. And we were paying people based on delivering the results. And actually, you saw we turned somebody off because they weren't delivering the results, and we gave them extra time, and it didn't seem like it was going to happen. So we canceled the contract and gave it to somebody else who's making progress. Next question.
Charlie, quick question. Can you articulate what changes you see in designs, features, and rewards of the future public-private partnerships versus the broad language we've been using for a number of years? What are some of the future changes you would like to see in the public-private partnership structures?
Well, I'm not here I have lots of ideas on public-private partnerships. Those are really internal to the agency. But I just say that, figure out what you want first. What's your specific goal you want? And this gentleman is talking about, creating, buying something, anything in the space. It's really hard to go to Congress and say, well, we're going to pay somebody, you give us some money to pay somebody for anything. You really have to come up, well, why do you need it? Well, we need ISS cargo delivery. That's something very specific. So it's always comes down to the deal. What's the value proposition? And there's dozens of ways to get to the answer. And so it becomes an act of creativity, and there's many ways you can get there and working through the difficulties. So I always want additional tools, and I'm interested in that. But there's a lot we can do right with the existing tools, and having a few more tools could be very useful. So, I'm not going to call out any specific one because that's really an internal agency type activity. Is that John in the back? I'm sorry, who's in the back? They didn't answer. I can't see, I'm sorry. Okay.
Maybe you can't answer this, but how might one structure a public-private partnership to develop space solar power?
There's a lot of ways to do that. There's a lot of tools. You could do matching funds and technology. You'd have to ask, why would the agency care? And then, maybe it's in-space power beaming. Maybe it's advanced lunar power beaming, power access. We have to figure out why does the agency want it, and then structure a deal that makes sense to both parties. So it's a wide open question. There's 10 different ways you could structure a deal depending on what the incremental activity was, Al. The issue is getting people to want to cut a deal. If both sides want, then you can work something out. That's usually where the problem is you know, you want to cut a deal, but they don't.
In terms of the kind of growth that you're looking for, it seems like the examples you had before were just all mostly transportation, which was already an existing massive market for 2,000 years. And how do you get around the fact that there's not much up in space to go to, or a large number of people in space to come back down to Earth? How do you bootstrap like that? And it seems like aviation bootstrapped off of there was already a massive market for transportation before aviation ever showed up.
Well, there was a massive market for ISS cargo delivery, and we started that. You have to identify the needs, and sometimes the needs are not so clear to people. So identify an unfulfilled need or fulfill it in a different way. And Clayton Christensen and Disruptive Innovation has looked at different business models. I suggest that in part of thinking of public-private partnerships, we look to other types of models of how we do it. ISS cargo delivery was one. It was an existing need. Commercial crew is another. Cruiser is another. There are other needs in orbit that could be expressed and carved out in such that the government was buying it in a more commercial way. And I'll just leave it at that.
Do we have time for one more?
Thank you.
All right, sorry I had to cut that a little short. We're running out of time for questions on that one. So next up,